heard the name John Pilger mentioned. A fantastic journalist, award-winning journalist, a heroic and courageous journalist. One of the reasons why I came into journalism. He was a great friend to Julian, a great campaigner for truth and for justice. And it's very sad that we lost him last month. But for all the fawning obituaries that we saw in the press, it was that very same press that marginalised him, that moved him from this award-winning heroic journalist to a crank, a weirdo, a Putin apologist. We all know the terms, we all know the narrative. Robert Fisk, exactly the same happened to Robert Fisk. He was pushed to the margin, an award-winning journalist, a journalist that went on the ground and reported from the ground, an old-school journalist, as you say. Another one of my heroes who I was fortunate enough to meet when I was in Beirut. And if you don't toe the line, not only do you become a threat to power, you become a target of power, which is exactly why Julian, who has committed no crime, who's been convicted of no crime, is currently in a high security prison, the kind of prison that is usually reserved for those that have committed terrorist acts. Yet his crime was exposing those who have committed terrorist acts. That's why he's there. Now, let's not pretend that our governments, that our media organisations really care about press freedom, because they don't. And it's very clear that they don't. Now, you can look at what's happening in Gaza right now as a classic example of that. Journalists being killed day after day after day. Why? Because they're exposing the truth about what's happening in Gaza. They're exposing the truth about the horrors and the war crimes and the atrocities that are being committed by Israel with the collusion of the British state and the American state. That is why they're being killed. And that is why, even just 2 years ago, the television station in Gaza was destroyed by Israel. And just last month, and we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, which you all remember very, very clearly. Just last month I was in Belgrade, the Serbian capital, and I saw the remains of the RTS, the radio and television service of Serbia, that building destroyed. That building destroyed because it was deemed a legitimate target by NATO forces. Nobody has ever been held accountable for what is a war crime. Very clearly a war crime, as defined under the Geneva Convention. The people that died, there's a plaque to the people that died in there. These were people that were working, young people mainly, poor people, working as makeup artists, and this kind of thing, that were trapped inside that building that was destroyed deliberately by a NATO missile. And just the only person that's ever been convicted is the manager of that building for failing to get the people out on time before the NATO missile struck. Absolutely sickening. Sickening. And we're coming up to the anniversary of that attack. Now I work, and I have to say, by the way, that the building was deemed a legitimate target, and it was repeated, the statement was repeated by The Guardian years later in order to justify that attack. I work in an area that doesn't reach the newspapers in this country, doesn't reach the television screens across the West. I work in a place called Donetsk, you probably know it. It's in the eastern part, or the contested area, shall we say, between Ukraine and Russia. It's on the front line of what's happening. And I can tell you very clearly that you're being lied to about what's happening there. Just recently, for example, I attended a massacre of 28 people in a marketplace. Poor people, elderly people, men and women selling fresh fruit and vegetables by the side of the road in a covered market. 27 people that had their lives snuffed out by Western weapons. 27 people who had names, 27 people who had people that loved them. 27 people whose names or lives weren't deemed worthy enough to report on by the Western press. 28 people in a bakery in Lysychansk. 28 people, including a pregnant woman and a child, whose names weren't worthy to be reported on by the Western press. And we're seeing this there day after day. And the people that are reporting on this, a colleague of mine, Rostislav Zhurovlev, who was a RIA Novosti journalist, he was killed in a cluster munition attack just a day after the United States authorized its use in that area. Ironically, he was traveling in a car with other journalists, having been on the ground in Zaporozhye, investigating the use of cluster munitions on civilian communities there. Now, we're here because of Julian Assange today. And Stella mentioned in her speech, and people forget this, when we're given assurances that Julian's safety, his health and safety, will be looked after by the United States. Now, nobody believes what the United States says, especially when it comes to safety, democracy, and press freedom. But what we do know, and Stella mentioned this, in 2021, Yahoo News broke a story that the CIA plotted to murder Julian on the streets of London with the collusion of the British intelligence services. Now, why do you think they want to do that? Last year, I was at the scene. I was in Iraq, in Baghdad, and I went to the scene of collateral murder. And again, the collateral murder, two of the people that were killed were journalists, Reuters journalists, targeted again by US forces. Those same US forces that laughed as they sprayed bullets and missiles down on a civilian population, massacring them in cold blood. The bullet marks and the holes are still there, and the community is still wounded by what happened that day. I spoke to a man, I spoke to many people, eyewitnesses, but I spoke to a man who lost his family on that day. And he said to me that it shouldn't be Julian Assange that is on trial here today. He said that it's George W. Bush and Tony Blair that should be on trial as war criminals, and that Julian Assange should be released and he should be treated as a hero. And shame on them for not doing that. But we know why. We know who the real criminals are. But I just want to finish really because, there we go, support for Julian everywhere. But Jyoti spoke just before me. I'm a journalist, I'm a member of the National Union of Journalists, and I can't see my union here today. I can't see the placards or the banners. I didn't receive the emails mobilizing us to come to the court today to protest for press freedom for Julian Assange. You have to ask why. Shame on them.
Shame on you.
And shame on the Labour movement for not being here today. Shame on the Labour Party for not being here today. Where are they, these so-called defenders of freedom and democracy? Where are they today? They're not here, they're not with us. And I'll just finish by saying, really echoing what Jyoti was saying earlier, is that how can we stop this? How do we stop? It's all very well and good saying free Julian Assange, but how do we free him? How does that happen? We have the power as an organised mass, as the organised working class, to free Julian Assange. That power is in our hands, and we need to be mobilising and taking concrete actions to shut down the courts, to shut down the prisons, to shut down all of the state institutions that are locking up Julian Assange. That's how we do it. We need to build a mass mobilisation, a mass organisation to do that, and only then can we free Julian Assange. Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you.